All right, this is about memory. There are some tricks and hacks that can improve the individual ability to recall information. What they choose to do with that is, their own choice on any individual level. So there's people that memorize brand names and toy lines, and rules for games that have no impact on reality. I am in that group as well. Science, facts, and information, other things. Things that are true, things that are untrue. And that informs their decision process. That is just how a mind works. That's people. One of the first things I learned about was chunking. And what chunking is, your short-term memory contains a finite number of slots. It varies. Some people with mental disabilities will be stuck at the small end. They may only have 3 or 4 short-term memory slots, effectively. Now, this is not, there is not a device called a short-term memory somewhere in your brain. There may be centers that are associated with it, but as far as the actual capacity and performance capability of a short-term memory, it's simply, it's a thing that exists that if there's brain damage or failure to develop in certain areas, it'll be limited. But it is not a thing. So when I'm talking about slots and chunks, I'm talking about an imaginary space in your consciousness that constitutes your interface or interaction with short-term memory, which is whatever you want it to be. Figuring out how to conceptualize and imagine and functionally interact with it is an individual process. That's all I can say about that. There's no real set of steps. Some meditation, get in touch with yourself and your imagination, think inwardly. And if you're incapable of doing this, then it's not for you. Chunking is where you begin to sort information so that when you are keeping things in your mind, when you're keep in mind this, remember this, you're using an aspect of short-term memory to, it's like RAM. You've got a memory space where you store information for immediate access that can be cleared and filled with other things. That is random access memory, in effect. Short-term memory is superior to RAM because it has a much quicker biological access to the overall long-term memory, and we'll get into that later. Both what constitutes long-term memory as well as some things that are interactions between. Chunking is when you can lump groups of topics together. So you come up with a term, you come up with a variable. It is a little more efficient if you think in terms of equations rather than in terms of definitions in the dictionary or encyclopedic or thesaurus sense. Although they do have uses. But for this part, for the basics of chunking, is just that. Now, stop thought words fall into this category in a sense, but again, that's verbal that's using definitions and terms, whereas you can lump things together. If you go outside, you can have the environment. This is a concept, a short-term memory chunk if you are environmental awareness for being in it. Not thinking of the climate, but your surroundings. So like when I go out tracking, I've got one spot in short-term memory for environmental awareness. And this is everything to do with my senses. All sensory input being consciously dealt with, I intentionally, consciously think of as this one category. So that my short-term memory draws all of the information it needs from the one thing, rather than, were there 6 or 7 different topics that I just listed, each one of those having its own slot, which then is like, your RAM is at like 80% use. Or you can have it over here at like 5% or whatever for this concept. So it's an efficiency in computation done inwardly. And it takes practice, but your brain is an incredibly adaptive, incredibly fast computer. So a healthy brain is the superior computation device or source or whatever, however you want to look at it. Everyone's brain is like this. You know, your consciousness and the fact that you're a living supercomputer, all people have this capacity inside. Your dreams do so much stuff. You've got to understand what it takes to do that. And that 10% of your brain business is nonsense. That we only use exponent, that's nonsense. You use your entire brain all the time. Now, whether your capacity, whether you're keeping your RPMs at 1,000 as opposed to revving them up or whatever, that's different. But everyone's inherently has the capacity for some pretty superior computation. So once you start thinking in chunks, you can begin taking in information. But basically, you have to sort the information on some level. So you can have a space in short-term memory for your attention span of sorting. Or you can just use the rest of it and not think of it in terms of a finite space, because by chunking, you can get it down. There are, I guess you could say there's parallels in it's the process of learning. So the more efficiently you learn, if you learn techniques for memorization, for example, pair them with things like chunking, you can input and assimilate vast amounts of information. So learning how to learn is not as, I think that might be an entire separate video, but there's a whole set of, like do Sudoku, do Rubik's Cube, do things that engage your brain in different places and work them like they're muscles. It's not an actual muscle, obviously, but if you have good nutrition and your sugars and fats are at omega-3s and stuff like that and glucose, not sucrose, you can have a healthy functioning brain that is having the platform to start with. So if you make sure that you've got, what this means is if you're hankering for fish or chicken, it's because your brain wants more omega-3s. As opposed to if you're hankering for sweets, you should eat some red meat kind of thing. But the other thing is specifically, you can find things like, I once saw that looked like some kind of gummies or juji fish or something that were made from glucose instead of sucrose or dextrose or fructose. The kind of sugar is important too. So learning how to learn is basically, there is some debate and theory and mystery yet as to how brains, cognitive science, things like this, as topics to look for, that's a good one to go for. Cognitive science is amazing. Dig into all the different research and theories, because in there you'll find some commonalities. And you learn about the process of taking in information. You learn about logic and reason and the act of thinking. Like I said, that's a whole other set of topics. Once you know how to learn better, you're using chunking, and it is possible to have a part of your short-term memory constantly writing to your long-term memory. Now, there's also medium-term memory, and that's just kind of a nebulous. Think of it as a distance from the center. The center is consciousness. You've got your short-term memory right here, and obviously it's smaller than the other spheres of memory. And your short-term memory is in chunks, right? So this is your short-term memory, except that there's like 9 fingers when you're running top form. Each of these fingers runs off to a different, not a location, but a different layer or a different part of the brain. Because the thing is, your brain, this is part of learning how you learn cognitive science. Your brain is the processor, but it's also the memory. And there is a thing called processor in memory, where it's like you've got a program running in RAM. The processor of the computer is processing everything, but there's an algorithm in memory that is writing itself rather than using the actual processor. But the processor is guiding the access to all of this. Your memory does something similar. Your brain cells are the processor components. Those interactions of all these cells doing their thing is processor cycles, but at the same time, the quantum states of the cells, the nature of the different chemical compositions and locations of the cells are the memory, the storage, the all of it. And at the same time, it's got to be some kind of holographic principle, which is to say that every piece contains a bit of all of the whole, because, and the whole contains all the pieces in some sense, because you can lose a brain cell and not, you can lose a brain cell and not lose a memory. You lose too many brain cells, you can lose a lot. But that's more of a potential loss of computation. So writing to long-term memory just means you've got the next layer out from, let me get this done real quick. You got the next layer out from the short-term memory. Yeah, your point of consciousness at the center. The distance out, short-term memory is very close in. This is your immediate use. Your next out is kind of a medium-term memory. This is the things that have just come out of short-term memory but may go back into short-term memory. Farther out from that would be your long-term memory. Long-term memory is basically sorted, stored, not for frequent access, but it is there. So then you have to remember that you even have it, which means having some sort of a record of the things that you've had in short-term memory and where it's been written to. So like a file table for a hard drive. And you'll notice things that have not been used in a long time on a computer of any sort will have eventually been stored in a way that is less space consuming, but contains all the same. But it takes a second to access it because you've got to unpack the compressed file. This goes back to being able to transfer files that were much larger in a smaller format with zip and RAR. And even on these Android devices and everything else, things eventually get compacted for storage. compressed or whatever. So your brain can do this too. And the more compressed it is, the longer it takes for you to unpack it. So you can be like, I know this, why can't I remember this? Well, because it's been in storage for a long time. You need to give it a little time to think of something else for a minute. And when you come back to it, hopefully it'll be, well, while this sounds very computer-like and very, firmly delineated processes in a thing that is basically a bunch of sugary fat cells that are doing electrical things inside your brain as an animal, not this, devices, computers and things. But your brain does do this. You can totally do this. So you can keep an active record. Now, sometimes another trick that helps is writing things down. Okay, with external things, you're not using your memory. It's different when you're trying to access something on a GPS to give you information that you lack. It's another thing to write down something, especially when you're in the process of an active learning experience. By writing something down and watching yourself do it and thinking of what you're writing while you're writing it, you are putting multiple imprints of different types on this one visual memory or conceptual idea, but you're using a visual memory tag. Your visual, what they call the qualia, is the entire field of vision and everything that you mentally associate with it. It's your perceived experience of reality. Your brain files that separately. It keeps its own record of that as well. And so things within that, like a piece of paper with your own handwriting, which you should be intimately familiar with compared to other people. That's why you can read your own handwriting even if somebody else can't. Your brain does this. By knowing this is what I mean by learning how to learn, and why it's such a huge other topic to even go into that. But your memory is your ability to recall information, is your ability to immediately recall things that have recently been in memory in short term. I feel like some of the tricks that get played on people in the social, political, cultural arena of interactions, the world, as you might say. Again, categorizations matter. This is where verbal things versus you could be storing lists of numbers, lists of words, locations. Each of these can be chunks. But storing things that are topical has a whole other, that's a different hemisphere of the brain, I guess is what I'm getting at. It's a totally, learn how your brain works and understand that you consciously can interact with, unless you are afflicted by a disability or a serious mental illness. For many cases, there are ways to correct this, at least for long enough to learn the knack of this kind of introspective, what you might call inner work. It's not a bunch of crystal woo hocus pocus when you're really working with yourself. And if you have trouble maintaining a sense of identity / control over your own consciousness vessel generator, whatever you want to call it, there's things like self-hypnosis. You can find some like lists of affirmations or even subliminal message tapes and binaurals and stuff like that that can legit help you attune yourself so that you're not having so much difficulty dealing with your own inward self. Because, I mean, honestly, there's some people that, like, there's a detectable screech on the inside of their head, basically. Like, what is it like to be that guy? Ah! Just constantly. I've met people like this before. It's like I don't know what it represents, if it's a mental incapacitation, if it's just people push beyond their limits, if it's the result of damage, I don't know. But the opposite of that is someone whose mind is an inner calm, a silence, until think silence like a cursor flashing on an input, waiting for input. It's a prompt. So you think, okay, what's this? Oh, I mean, what do I know about that? You know, try and access something in memory. And you can even think about it in terms of distance. Wow, that's pretty far back. Let me go get that, you know. Some people build memory castles. This is a real thing. You literally imagine, and it sometimes helps to draw out, sketch a diorama of your memory castle to have a firmer idea in mind of how you access your information. I think I have a memory castle. It's like what your dreams are. The house in your dreams is like a memory castle. In a sense, it's the same kind of structure made out of cognitive things represented as a physical place that interacting with gives you access to. My channel name is named after my first tulpa. I was able to accidentally generate a self-aware, separate consciousness within me that was not a dissociative alter. It was like the conscious file allocation table memory manager prompt answer go getter. It was the kiosk. It named itself. It also self-terminated and was flawed. It had issues that I since have corrected, and the access to my memory is not a conscious entity of its own. That I would never do again. So my preferred mode is eidetic memory access. I've heard idelic used. That's a different type of memory. Idelic is, I guess, your ability to take in the information. So what I've been describing is idelic. Now the recall, the eidetic, would be practice, writing all short-term memory into its own long-term memory slot so that you've got a backup. It's like RAID double writing and having a backup, which means that if everything is backed up and cross-referenced, it simply accesses that much faster because your memory capacity is unfathomable. I'm not sure there is a limit to the depth. There's just a limit to how far the light of your consciousness reaches that you can immediately recall without having to go diving and digging for it in the darker aspects. And that's not even to mention wherever. Think of muscle memory. Think of your lizard brain, your base instincts, your immediate stop. That stuff actually comes from like the cosmic background radiation. It's the echo of the beginning that is outside and permeates in relation to the center, which is your point of observation, your little bubble of existence that is your consciousness. And much like the universe that you perceive that exists, that we exist within, that seems to be possibly infinite or bigger than we can read, your memory is its own universe in the same sense. That's why in legal sense, there's a universe of facts based on you have to make a microcosm of only these facts in order to be objective. So viewing the world from a subjective lens of the individual consciousness, it is still possible to be somewhat objective, although that's more of a relative thing. Depends on your own self-honesty. There are people that can claim to be objective, or they can be minimally, marginally objective, and you know that they're well aware but are choosing to go with the subjective. So that's all I'm going to cover for this one. I may have to refresh myself on cognitive science and bone up a bit on where they're at with it, but honestly, I'm going to say that probably the field of cognitive science has been either underfunded lately to keep people stupid, or only certain topics are researched. I don't know. There's a lot about the learning process and the individual mind that can also be hijacked, unfortunately. And the thing with all of it, though, is that the individual consciousness that gets hijacked has to grant permission. They have to still give some sort of choice or consent to be controlled on some level. It's not necessarily as obvious as a given choice, but there's a certain suspension of disbelief and other things that is like the give them a width of a hair, they'll poke you in the eye through that. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile, whatever. That people get controlled by the same means by which the individual can learn. And by individually choosing to actively learn and being an active thinker, you eventually become strong enough to casually just resist such things until they just don't work on you. You still have to self-check and be self-honest, but they just don't work. You're just eventually come to a point where you're like, oh, that's all bullshit, isn't it? Without having to really think hard about it. Because you've eventually managed to get that entire awareness, that entire way of thinking becomes a variable as a chunk in your short-term memory. And thus takes up less space, leaving the rest of your awareness and attention span for other things. I hope that has made sense as to why it's tricky to explain, but it's a fairly simple process, and it compounds upon itself once you get it working right. So this has been some thoughts on memory tips and tricks, and I go to work today. This will be uploaded at some point when it finishes.